I hope to have we will have an interesting discussion today. We're going to start by calling on our speaker to make brief remarks at the start, and then we have a couple of questions that will ask him, and then after the uh, remarks by our speaker, we will open the floor for questions from the participants. And after a couple of questions, if there's still time, we can just keep on open the floor for further questions. So yeah, we are honored to have our speaker for today, Daniel Koster. He is an economist and works at the Social Policy Unit of the International Trade Union Confederation. Hi, Daniel.
Hello, good afternoon, good night, good evening, good morning, depending where you are, guys. Pleasure to be with you. So if you want, we can start to share the screen.
Yes, Daniel.
Okay. I hope that everybody can see it.
We can see it, Daniel.
Perfect. So we start. You know, the idea is to discuss the issue of minimum wage, sometimes called living minimum wage, sometimes called just living wage, or and there is a big discussion about this thing. And sometimes one may say, why this single number that not many people recognize that is the one who is receiving or paying it causes so much fuss all over the world? What's the concept behind that, you know? And here I think that I would start with one first definition, that living wage is what you may call a social and political type of concept. It refers to a socially acceptable living standard for workers that should be achieved with the wage. Minimum wage, on the other hand, it's a legal definition. It's a statutory definition that says which is the minimum wage that somebody should pay when buying or contracting a person. So I will try to define somehow the context and the concepts around this, and then we can open for the discussion. As usually, here it is. Why did minimum wage or minimum living wage re-emerge as an issue in economic policy and in labor issues? There are many causes, and you cannot say it's just one, but the first one is the structural constraint that the economy has to generate well-paid and formal jobs. That means good jobs with labor protection, reasonable pay. That's why the people claim to have a minimum wage. The other issue is that in the last 25, 30 years, collective bargaining, that was the driving force of negotiation for wages in most of industrialized and Western countries, has started to show weaknesses, a drop in the rate of affiliation, and also a stronger monopsonic power or monopolistic power by employers reduce the strength of collective bargaining. This, again, as I mentioned, it's a reduction in the rate of unionization, but also the expansion of the so-called working poor, that people that independently of having a job and working full-time, they don't reach certain level of well-being. In the past, again, especially in Western countries, industrial countries, you could say that to have a job was enough not to be poor, perhaps not to be rich or buy things, but at least not to be poor. This thing is not happening anymore in many countries, even nowadays in developed countries like the United States or the UK. The other issue is the increasing informalization that many countries face. That means people that gets into the labor market with what we call also non-standard forms of employment or irregular employment, non-declared workers to the social security. So all these put pressure to governments to include a minimum wage as a legal level for paying workers, which are, according to the ILO or the International Labor Standards, the two pillars to approach to minimum wages and collective bargaining. The minimum wage is the minimum amount of remuneration that an employer is required to pay wage earners for a work performed during a period of time. That's the basic thing. And this minimum amount cannot be reduced by collective agreement or by individual contract. An employer cannot say, no, I'm not paying the minimum wage because I agree with my worker, and the worker would say, yes, I agree with my employer to get paid less. Or I agree with the union that I am going to pay under minimum wage. There's no way. Once you have the statutory minimum wage, there's no way of reducing it. And the collective agreement is the one that offers the mechanisms to set wages above that floor and can reinforce that dynamic, the compliance with the minimum wage. What would be a statutory minimum wage? Here, if we see a theoretical distribution of wage earners, we have here the number of workers in the vertical axis. Can you see the cursor also? And
yes.
Okay, and we have in the horizontal the wage level from the lowest to the highest. So we find that the light blue area is a so-called collective bargaining zone. All these workers are under the union in the collective bargaining agreement, where they negotiate the salaries of unskilled workers, technical people, engineering, etc., etc. But here you have a number of workers, those that are under 6, that are, or 5 to 1, that they don't have the support of the collective bargaining. Those are the ones that require the support of a minimum wage by statutory or by law. What is expected from a minimum wage? Minimum wage allows to interact in the 3 different spheres of economic activity according to each one of the tripartite negotiators: workers and the families, employers and enterprises, and governments and the overall economic policy. So what's the first pillar of a minimum wage, or what we expect from a minimum wage? To fulfill the needs of the workers and the family. We are expecting that, right? But that should be in the context of sustainable enterprises, because we could say, okay, minimum wages are going to be whatever amount, but there are not enterprises that can pay that minimum wage, yeah? Because it's well above what the business can pay to them. But also, the third sector, the government, requires steady economic growth and high rates of employment. So this simple number of the minimum wage has to make a balance, has these 3 constraints that they have to be put together. That's why collective bargaining and tripartite negotiations are so important in the framework of the definition of the minimum wage. The good, fair, decent, sensible, meaningful, acceptable, or functional minimum wage should be the one that considers the all 3 areas. Otherwise, it won't last. If the workers cannot survive, it won't last. You will have rebellions, strikes, or workers will move to other countries or other areas. If the prices are not sustainable because they make a loss for paying wages, they are not going to survive. And if the government doesn't see that unemployment rate is going down, or on the contrary, that it's going up, and the economy is not growing, that minimum wage is not going to be good or fair or fulfill the demands. What are the elements that we try to consider in the process of minimum wage setting and adjustment? Because the idea is to have a living, mobile minimum wage. That means that the minimum wage is not that you cast in stone in 1935 and it's going to last forever. No, it's a very dynamic context, not only because of inflation and the changes in the relative prices, also because social standards of what's necessary and what is not necessary are also very variable. I remember 25 years ago, mobile phones were only for rich guys or those that they were in illegal businesses that never got an office, you know, or real estate agents also because they didn't have an office. Nowadays, everybody has and needs a mobile phone. When I was a kid, we only have a 14-inch TV set in my house that all the family will sit in the living room to watch black and white television. Nowadays, you have a TV set almost everywhere, in every room in the household. So there are many things that they move, they adjust. That's why the minimum wage should be also adjusted, not only because of inflation. The Convention 131 of the ILO, the Minimum Wage Convention, and the Recommendation 135, they are the backbone into the ILO regulation on minimum wages, and they say that the elements to be considered in determining the minimum wage shall, so far as possible and appropriate in relation to national practice and condition, shall include the following. First, the need of the workers and their families. It's not the individual workers. You know, in some countries, like Indonesia, for example, they say, no, the minimum wage is for the single worker. Okay, you may set it for a single worker, but so that you should guarantee that those that they have a family, you shouldn't pay like a single worker. So it's the workers and their families. We know that in some areas, families are like Philippines or Asia in general, are the extended family, you know, with a very mobile shape. Also, you may have the nuclear family that used to be, because now it's not anymore, in the West, that you have daddy, mommy, and the two kids. Yeah. So this is a very, I would say, socially different concept that should be taken into account. And what the others say that the minimum wage should also take into account the other level of wages in the country. Yeah, it's not a wage that should be either higher than the other wages or lower than the other wages. It should be in relation to that. Take into account the cost of living. You cannot set a minimum wage that is under the cost of living of a country, because otherwise, I remember I had a big discussion in Cambodia some years ago where I said to the guy representing employers, he came and said, why should I pay what they need to send to the village? I said, well, you should pay what the person needs to live. And he said, well, but I don't, if he wants to live better or worse, well, that's not my issue. And I say, well, slavery used to be much more reasonable, because the owner of a slave, he would pay him to eat, he would pay him for health, because they were his property. So if you don't pay enough for the worker and the family to survive, well, they'd rather be slaves. So the guy got really pissed off with me. He complained that I accused him of being a slave master, but actually the thing is that they don't want to consider all these other issues. The other issues that should be taken into account are the social security benefits. Why? Because sometimes there are social goods and services that governments provide to the workers, and they are considered there. If you have to pay private schooling for your kids, that should be calculated into the cost of living. But if the government is giving you public school, good education, or health, those things are also taken a part in the consideration. And then the relative standards of other social groups, farmers, informal workers. These are the groups that also define the overall standard of living in the country. The other set of issues are the economic factors, which are more loose in the convention, because it's very difficult to measure and quantify them. They say the requirements of economic development, the levels of productivity, the desirability of attaining and maintaining high levels of employment. Well, if you see the first set of indicators, we can quantify them. If we see the second level of indicator, that's very much more, I would say, politically defined or politically biased, depends on many other things. So, which are the dilemmas that we have in relation to minimum wages? The first one, and I will go in detail into each one of them, is the issue of imperfect information and interest. Who is represented in minimum wage negotiation? The other dilemma is, should we have one minimum wage or multiple minimum wages? Again, we will go into this discussion. The third issue is, should we use an evidence-based formula, or we should open the discussion and the negotiation? What's the minimum wage? It's a trigger for collective bargaining, or or should be a corrector of collective bargaining? Should we set the minimum wage before collective bargaining takes place, or after collective bargaining took place and we correct with minimum wage? Well, in principle, it's like playing a chess of three people. You know, I found this very funny graph, and you don't really know very well how to, the logic is different, because we have in the table three negotiators that they look to three different things. You know, one is looking, it's like driving the car, and you want to say, okay, how are we doing? And one will tell you, well, we are going 80 kilometers per hour. And the other one will tell you, well, we still have 20 liters of gasoline. And the other one would say, well, tires are okay. Each one is looking to a different thing. So that's why it's so important to bring them all together into a negotiation table. And one of the problems is that imperfect markets, we call the economies. That means that those that they pay the minimum wage sometimes are not there in the negotiation table, because the minimum wage sometimes is paid by small-scale enterprises, informal type of companies, rural enterprises, and in the national wage councils, you have the larger firms, the industries that they have their own dynamic. I participated in a number of national wage councils, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, in my country, Argentina, that sometimes the employers, they say, I don't know what I'm doing here. I already pay more than what these guys are asking for. But also, sometimes those that they earn the minimum wage are not there. The unions, you know, for example, a big part of the unions in Malaysia were from the banking sector. And they say, I don't know how people survive with the amount of the minimum wage. Why? Because they already got more than that, yeah? So those that they use the minimum wage, the lower skilled workers, the non-unionized workers, and the small scale enterprises that they don't have a corporate representation, sometimes are not there. So that's one of the problems that we may see. Informal workers, and somebody would say, well, informal workers are not represented in the minimum wage, and I will show you that that's not true. The minimum wage is a lighthouse for the labor market. It's the only signal of the labor market that people have in consideration. If you ask somebody how much is the liter of gasoline, they know the price. And if you want to calculate how much it would cost me to travel from one point to another in any country, you think in gasoline liters or gallons or whatever. If you ask somebody how much is the exchange rate, how much is the dollar, you have it every day in the newspapers. If you ask somebody how much is the kilo of rice, you will have it there. But how much do you pay a worker for painting a wall? I'm sure that you will get a different approach and different numbers. So that's why labor markets tend not to have a referential value, only the minimum wage. That's why it's so important, the minimum wage. And you know, we did, in economics, you never do like laboratory experiments like you would do in physics or in chemistry, but sometimes there are cases where you can precisely see this, and we did this exercise in Myanmar. I will show you here the distribution of wages in Myanmar. Myanmar had, in 2015, they didn't have a minimum wage. They started in 2017, 2016. 1st of January, they implemented minimum wage. So we had a labor force survey in 2015, before the minimum wage was implemented, and a labor force survey in 2017, soon after the minimum wage was implemented. And you will see how it behaved. Here we have the frequency distribution of wages. So you will see that 0, it's more or less how much the 50% of the population is earning. You will see that here you have the majority of the population. Then you will have, to the right-hand side, you will have like two bumps of the higher pay workers. These would be more or less the minimum wage workers. There are those that are a little bit above, and here are the more skilled workers earning. But to the left, you have this large number of workers that are earning much less than what the 50% of the population earns. And here you have the bottom, rural workers, eventual workers, casual workers. This was before the implementation of the minimum wage. You have a very clear, I would say, multi-type of labor market, very differentiated. What happened after minimum wage came towards? 0 is the amount of the minimum wage. So you see that you have a big concentration of workers at the part of the minimum wage and a little bit high. Then you have here the second bump, the higher skilled workers. And here you have those that they were very far away before the minimum wage was implemented, getting closer to a minimum wage. These are informal workers. These are the less skilled eventual workers. So we can see how the labor market gets more homogeneous when you introduce a minimum wage. Then comes the issue of one or multiple minimum wages. So some people will try to say, well, you know, it's a minimum wages cannot be only one. In the case of Filipina, you have by regions, by size of enterprise, by sector of the production. In Vietnam, you have 4 different regions. In India, you have by state. In Indonesia, you have by district. So you have 240 different rates, but each district, they define their own minimum wage. And if you ask me the question, which is better? Well, there's no very simple question. Many times, the minimum wage is in relation to the leading sector, like in Cambodia. The minimum wage is set to the garment sector, which is the leading, the one that has the most formal employment, the largest number of workers. So the compliance in the other sectors is quite low. Or you have regional difference in cost of living. Say, if you set the national one, well, some regions would be much higher than the cost of living, and some others won't be enough for the cost of living. So would be advisable to do this? Depends on how different are the cost of living. The other issue is that when you have one single minimum rate, it's very easy to communicate. People know how much they have to pay. In the case of Thailand, for example, until 2015 or 16, they had only one, 300 baht per day. So everybody knew that. So if you wanted somebody to clean your house, or a driver, or very naturally, I would say, precarious activities, everybody will tell you how much was the minimum wage because they knew. After the coup d'etat, they came with this system of state minimum wages, where one was 316, the other was 312.50, the other was 306. So it became so complex that people didn't know. And when you have a limit state capacity for the enforcement, it's more likely that the violation of the minimum wage are going to be much more independent of the level of the minimum wage. In Vietnam, for example, they have 4 different levels, and they are moving towards 3 different levels. It's true, sometimes the minimum wage is not enough for those that they live in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, which are more expensive, but also in those cities you have more opportunities to earn more than one single minimum wage in the household. So that's another difference. The size of the families are different. You have in some areas of Indonesia 3.5 members per household, and in some other areas you have 8 members per household. So it becomes much more complex to define. The other issue with a single or a multiple minimum wage is how do you deal with domestic work and home workers, those that are paid by piece, for example. Not only by hour, because time in the minimum wage scheme, it's relatively easy, but those that they are piece workers, how you define that? Or those that they do domestic work and they live in the household where they work, or they are provided, like plantations in Malaysia, they are provided by housing because they are migrant workers that they live there. Those are issues that also should be taken into consideration for the analysis. And the other issue is seasonal workers. If you pay seasonal workers the bare minimum wage, what are they going to do in the off season when they don't have the work? So there you have to compensate for the time that they are not going to be working, because to some extent, seasonal workers, they are, I would say, available to take the seasonal job without taking another job. So those are issues that are sometimes difficult to resolve, that one single number is not going to sort it out and should be considered, especially by unions, because I think that those areas, those industries that they have a very clear specificity for work, they should consider to differentiate the minimum wage from what you may call the basic remuneration of an industry. So in a different industry, you have different characteristics where you could negotiate. Seasonal rural workers, they cannot negotiate in the same way as hourly home domestic workers. Yeah, piece workers is the other problem that has its own calculations. Then the other controversy is, should we have a formula, or we should open the negotiation without the formula? Formula tends to add transparency to the negotiation and the calculation of the minimum wage. Yeah, because if you say, well, we have to adjust with the consumer price index or the price of food or the basket for workers, that helps as a starting point for the negotiation. But they have to be clear with the availability of data, and the methodology of analysis or transformation or use of the data should be shared. You know, sometimes we have this issue of the employers that they say, well, gasoline prices increased by 20%, our cost of production increased by 20%. But actually, that's not true. Yeah. Or if they say, okay, if you want 10% more wages, we are going to increase our prices by 10%. That's also not true, you know, because labor is not the only cost of production. So the openness and transparency is a very important issue. Social dialogue plays a great role in the negotiation of a formula, because you can say, okay, we will use a formula. This is the formula, but the formula has to be agreed by social dialogue. It's not something that should be imposed. Huh? You negotiate and you define, for us workers, inflation is this important and productivity is this important. Yeah, so this will be and this will tend to reduce discussions in the near future, and you may revise every 5 years, for example, the formula. In Indonesia, they defined a formula in 2015. They were supposed to revise it in 2020, but I would say that in an abuse of power, in the framework of the pandemic, and with the unions without being able to mobilize because they were in quarantine, you know, in lockdown in many places, the government and employers, they passed a law that was a very abusive one, and after an appeal to the Constitutional Tribunal in Indonesia, they have to withdraw the law. They have to revise the law again in order to reinstate the things, because they didn't want to discuss with workers. The formula that they had there was a sensible formula that they could revalidate and change the system in other areas. The problem for the formula is how you assess the components. Again, CPI or consumer price index or inflation, it's important for workers. Productivity may be important for employers, or economic growth would be important for government. So if we discuss a law, let's try to assess the components in a sensible way and negotiate that. The other problem is the counterfactual, because everybody will say, well, if we wouldn't increase the minimum wage, employment would go up, or GDP growth would go up. Well, that's a counterfactual. That's, I don't know, I would say it's a fantasy. Nobody knows what would happen if, whatever, if I would have wings, perhaps I would be able to fly. I don't have wings, I don't fly. Yeah, so it's a part of the discussion. And then it comes, how do we use the formula? Do we work with the level or the change? Here, for example, this is a formula that Brazil used to have before Bolsonaro came. So they would use to change the level of the minimum wage, the change in the CPI in the previous year, the consumer price index of the previous year, and the change on GDP in 2 years ago. So that's a way to balance, you know, and every 1st of January, they used to change the minimum wage. Costa Rica had a complex formula because they tried to work in advance. This is, as you see here in Brazil, you are trying to correct the effects of growth and inflation. In Costa Rica, they try to advance that. They say, okay, we have the expectations by the central bank in terms of the inflation, CPI, and in terms of GDP per capita, the growth of GDP per capita. So we will put the full CPI, and then we will have an adjustment according to how much economic growth that will go into the minimum wage. Yeah. France, the thing is more clear. In France, they want to correct the minimum wage as a corrector of what's happening in the collective bargaining, because they use the CPI and a percentage of the hourly wage of blue-collar workers. They have a category of blue-collar workers, that means operational workers, that they collect all the data, so they adjust in this way. It's the average between these two indicators, and that's the change that they will implement every September of the minimum wage. The Netherlands, they take all the collective agreements that are registered twice per year, the 1st of July and the 1st of January, and they put all those changes, weighted average of all those changes of the collective agreements into the minimum wage. So again, we have those that tend to correct. An interesting case is Malaysia. Don't worry, because it looks more complex than what it is. I'm going to explain you. They define a formula. The bluish part, the first part of the formula, tells you the level. The second part tells you the adjustment. So every 5 years, they have the household surveys where they calculate the following indicators: the poverty line income for a family, how much a family should get as income not to be poor, and they divide that family poverty line by the average number of workers or wage earners in the household, and they take the median wage. The median wage would be the amount that divides the labor market into extremely similar parts, 50% to one side, 50% to the other, and that value they average. That would define the level. But every year you have to adjust until you have the next survey that will give you all these values. How do they adjust? First of all, they include the productivity growth. Productivity growth is the total GDP over the number of employees. How much increase the productivity growth, that will increase the minimum wage. And then the consumer price index in percentage, how much the inflation rate was, the CPI, and they include the minimum wage. But they have a correction that says, if the unemployment rate is above 4%, we just scrap this part of unemployment. We adjust only the productivity and the CPI. If the unemployment rate goes under the minimum wage, under the 4%, that is what they call natural rate of unemployment, we will reduce the adjustment. Because if the unemployment is very low, you would tend to think that the median wage would be increasing, so they consider 4% the threshold. So this is a very creative way of using it, but let me, spoiler alert, as they say, when they talk about movies. They devised this formula, which is very interesting, because the poverty line over the number of wages would consider what one of the points of the Convention 131 said, the needs of workers and the families. We can discuss if poverty or not poverty, but that would be the first. But the second part, the median wage, will consider the other remunerations or the other wages in the economy. So that they will consider two parts. And then the changes in productivity and the changes in the cost of living. Yeah, so it's a very creative one. But unfortunately, they never implemented. Now I'm advising the unions there in Malaysia. I told them, guys, pick up the formula, because that goes in your favor at this point. Force the government to implement this formula, to go with the formula to negotiate. But they didn't implement it. Why? Because it's very creative, it's very sensible, it's very nice, but it's too high for what the employers want to pay. Oh, sorry, I forgot to show all the errors. Okay, the minimum wage is a trigger or a corrector of the collective bargaining. Well, if you increase the minimum wage, what do you do? And this happened in South American countries, in Argentina, Ecuador, Uruguay, Brazil, in 2000, between 2003, 2004 until 2015, you compress the wage structure. Yeah, so you push the bottom, and you know that collective bargaining is a little bit lazy. You push the bottom, and the workers that they say, hey, I used to earn 60% more than the minimum wage, and now I am 45 more than the minimum wage. Okay, let's go to negotiate. Let's put pressure to our union, or the union, let's put pressure to employers to renegotiate, to restructure the difference in the different skills and the different areas. Yeah, so that would be a trigger of the negotiation. During the pandemic, I was reading a report by the OECD that didn't wasn't published yet, but will be published soon, that they say that minimum wages in European and OECD countries increase even more than the average wages. Why? Because government, they saw that that was a problem during the pandemic, that unions couldn't push for wages because of the pandemic and the close down of enterprises. So that was a way of putting pressure to trigger the negotiation. Then you have this, like the example of France and Netherlands, where you find that the collective bargaining is moving away from the minimum wage, so they increase the minimum wage to correct those differences, to bring equality into a system. A country that never had minimum wage was Germany, and since 2015 they implemented one. Why? Because of these things that we were saying at the beginning. Non-standard forms of employment, informality, and sectors that they were being left outside of the collective bargaining and the negotiation. Some other countries, like the case of Costa Rica, but this is not here and not in the formula, they have a mixed system because they advance one part, but they revise what happened on the other. Okay, one size doesn't fit all. So if you came to this training thinking that you were going to have the silver bullet that will tell you what to do, no. There's no single answer to the challenges that labor market imposing policy, precisely because of the heterogeneity of countries, the heterogeneity of regions, the heterogeneity of sectors. Conflicts of interest that you have in this negotiation can be only coped by the political will of organizing the labor market. But you have to have clear objectives in the short run and in the long run. Because if you start, since you are affecting the income of households, you may be affecting long-term decision by households. You know, you have your 15-year-old daughter and your salary is not enough, so you decide, well, you have to move out from school and go to clean houses in the city because we need to survive or to pay the medicines of your grandma. Yeah. So the implications of a wage policy are not only in the short run, like could be the profits of an enterprise, but also in the long run and with intergenerational implications for the households. We always say that it's clear to maintain it's important to maintain clear objectives of sustainable policy with high levels of employment. Looking for full employment is not just a slogan, it's something that countries and unions, we should push for. The second advice is make it as complex as necessary in terms of one or multiple regional, sectoral, industrial, whatever, but keep it as simple as possible. Yeah, if you need some complexity, more than one, okay, but keep it simple, because otherwise it's very difficult for compliance, for labor inspections, not only in emerging economies or third world countries, even in these countries, it's very difficult to control. It's very difficult to inspect every single firm. You only go to the ones that are visible. But nowadays, where you have people working from home, teleworking with computers, services, moving from one side to another, you have to keep the system as simple as possible to be easier to reach compliance. So it's a tension between two parties with the third party moving to one side to another. So here comes the recommendation. The best minimum wage is that one that leaves every and each one of the stakeholders unhappy. Yeah. But not so unhappy that would walk out of the room where the negotiation takes place. Okay, here I finish my presentation. Remember always this one. If somebody is very happy in a minimum wage negotiation, it's because they took an additional advantage that nobody was expecting. Yeah. If somebody walks out of the room, well, no minimum wage, no negotiation. Yeah. So remember, nobody will be happy after a minimum wage negotiation. Always workers will think that they need more, and it's true. Always employers will be thinking that they are paying a lot. Sometimes that's not true. And always the government will think that, well, this is not the best for growth and for our policy. But we have to keep struggling because it's minimum wages at a sensible level, living minimum wages are the most, I would say, comprehensive and reasonable policy in the labor market. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'm open for questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for that robust and insightful presentation. So I have some questions, but I'll open the floor for now. I'm sure some of them must have been provoked by some of the points that you raised. So yeah, maybe George, Gif, or Rasak has any questions to Daniel. Oh, or yeah, if none at the moment, maybe I could ask Daniel. In many cases, minimum wages are near to poverty wages instead of living wages. So I guess there are proposals that for minimum wages to rise to the level of minimum wage to the level of living wages, then it should be done progressively. So what do you think of this? And if you're okay with it, how can this be done? And what are set of policies to progressively raise minimum wages to living wages?
Well, again, something I said at the beginning, the concept of living needs, it's a socially acceptable concept and a very dynamic one. I think that it's very important to show a couple of things and to work, sometimes, and with all due respect, unions, they tend not to trust very much on technical explanations or technical things. They are great activists and in protesting, but sometimes, as I said once to our brothers and sisters of Malaysia, when it comes to technical issues, there are many weaknesses. I think it's very important, for many people, for many governments and employers, the most that they can concede is to the poverty line, to say, okay, let's put it at the poverty line level, the minimum wages. Minimum wages are the basic, they should be enough to fulfill poverty. Nobody would dare say, no, we want to pay wages that they keep the people under the poverty line. So they try to justify. So there, I think it's very important to show or to grab this other part of the convention, other wages in the economy and the living standards of other people. So you could do an analysis with expenditure survey. I try to do that in Philippines with some of the colleagues of the Ministry of Labor there to analyze workers. How much would be the basic basket of goods and services that workers consume? Yeah, differentiating from the poverty, which is the bare minimum in a society. And there you find that there are many differences. Who are the workers that they get the minimum wage? In general, they are younger workers, young couples, that they have little kids, that they have to spend in the health of the kids. You know, sometimes an adult, unless it's something very serious, you don't go to the doctor. You know, you just take an aspirin, you go to the pharmacy or alternative medicines. When it comes to a kid, you don't do that. If you have to vaccinate against measles or whatever, you have to go and buy the vaccine. Or when the kid has fever and you have to give antibiotics, you give the antibiotics. So that's why it's so important to have a more clear picture of the patterns of consumption of those workers that are what you may call at the minimum wage level, and see how they differ. Schooling is another big expenditure. Transportation, yeah? So the national averages don't represent the workers there, yeah? Nor the poor, that many times are in rural areas and they compensate with buying in local markets, or a plot where they produce for self-consumption. They have some chickens, a pig, and a bit of vegetables. No, workers, they work 8 hours and they have to buy the things that they consume. And where do they have to buy? They have to buy in the markets where they are closer. In Indonesia, we have this discussion with employers. Say, oh, these guys, where do they buy? They buy where they can buy. You know, you cannot think that they will walk 5 kilometers to go to buy the meat in one place and the vegetables in another, and then the hygiene products in another. You know, they buy where they can buy. They work already 8 hours, transport themselves for 1.5, 2, sometimes more hours to the workplace. So it's very important to find those, I would say, empirical evidences in order to define the basket that should be fulfilled by the minimum wage. And that would be above the poverty line, no doubt. It's true that in some countries you may have a distance. Well, the role of collective bargaining is to think how fast we get to that point. Ecuador in 2005 or 6, I think it was very far, the minimum wage to the so-called minimum or decent living basket. What did they do? They decided that every 3 months they are going to have an adjustment above the inflation rate in order to reach that point in 3 years. Of course, 3 years perhaps is too much for somebody who is living under the needs, but it's better than to close the eyes and walk away from the discussion on the negotiations. I don't know if I answered your question, Benji.
Yeah. But I guess one point that you mentioned is here in the Philippines, the National Wages and Productivity Council, at one point they had an estimate of the cost of living, but that was more than 10 years ago. Since then, they haven't reported any cost of living estimates. So that has, I guess, shows the problem, the challenges in actually estimating what is the
you have
the
to
basket
put
of
pressure.
goods.
You have to put pressure on them, because one thing that the Philippines has, besides the horrible traffic in Manila, it's a great statistical system. very sound professionals, very good technical people. So, and of course, if you go via the formal way, perhaps it's more difficult to get the, but I'm sure you have expenditure surveys there, you have almost everything. So go for that. Go for that. It's not, if they didn't adjust in the last 10 years, it's because the political authorities didn't allow them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's really true. So let me ask again if maybe George, Gif, or Rasak have anything to ask, or Adlira. Adlira has raised her hand, and then George after Adlira.
Yeah, mine is very short actually, and I'm sorry I had to go to another meeting, and perhaps you mentioned, but one of the questions we had in the previous session was whether the ILO provides any guidance about how often should the minimum wage be revised. And if you can tell us, I mean, we understand that the ILO does not give precise time in which that needs to happen, but if you can tell us from your experience.
Okay. Again, I cannot talk anymore for the ILO, but I can tell you for what ITUC we would suggest, or I would suggest, because it depends very much on the changes in the cost of living, right? In general, countries tend to do it every year, yeah, and there comes the discussion: are we adjusting to what happened in the past, or we adjusting to what's going to happen in the future, you know? And that's a clear difference. That so once you have an idea of how far the minimum wage is from a reasonable cost of living, there you could define how frequently, but never less than once per year. Less than stay 2, 3, 4 years with the same minimum wages. You know, I didn't include this thing because that's another of the dilemmas. Sometimes when you left untouched the minimum wage for some time, perhaps doesn't seem too bad, you know, and that there are not many problems. But the issue is that you start to gather pressure, you know, like it's like a cooking a machine, you know, the pressure starts to build up inside, and you don't realize that until everything goes to the air, you know. So that's why we think that when you have, if there's no date for the adjustment, you will start to have heterogeneous type of pressure. When you have a date, well, the people knows, okay, it will be in 3 months, we can wait, yeah, we can improve our calculations, we could push for a little bit more, but we know that there is a date, the 25th of August, we are going to sit down and negotiate. When it's uncertainty in relation to the date, the only way of calling the minimum wage council is to start to shout, unless the government has the initiative. Employers, they are never going to push for the adjustment. Yeah, employers, they don't like, number one, to pay taxes. They don't like, number two, to pay wages. It's a matter of principle. It's in their DNA, the reluctancy to pay. They don't care spending in consultants, advertisements, fancy dinners or trips, but paying salaries for them, it's like it's something that you are grabbing from their flesh, as well as taxes. So my suggestion is never less than once per year. I mean, more time than once per year, and have some sort of regularity. That helps a lot, the predictability in the system.
Thanks, Daniel, for those response. And then I call on George. I know we're over time, but maybe this the last question from George.
So thank you. And Dan, thank you so much for this presentation, because along the line, I had some confusion over how to keep minimum wage as complex as possible, but also as simple And now it is clear to me. But along the line, there was another concept that had been confusing me. And it has to do with when we talk about informal sector, and along the conversation in the clips, I found out that we should formalize the informal, and I'm wondering how can we formalize the informal in line with what we are discussing in minimum wage. So if you could do a little light on that, I would be happy. Thank you.
Oh, that's I would say the $1 million question. Yeah. Perhaps I wasn't very clear why the minimum wage also touches the informal sector. You have a big portion of the informal sector that is working in formal enterprises and with formal workers. Let's say a restaurant. The cook and the waiters, they are formal. The guy that washes the dishes is informal. So when you have an increase in minimum wage, that informal worker, he may not get the same salary as the formal worker, but for sure he will get the increase. Why? Because you guys say, come on, you increase the salary to them 10% and you are not giving me the rise. Yeah, in general, you don't want that type of difference in your working place, right? So that's one of the things. The other thing is because a number of informal workers, they are able to negotiate their salary, and the minimum wage is a very clear public referential value. Yeah, you call the plumber. Well, here in Belgium, where I am, the plumbers charge you more than a surgeon. But in regular countries, you call somebody a gardener, and he will calculate, okay, I'm losing the whole day here. I will work 4 hours to do this garden, and then I have 2 hours to work. So it's a one day of work. 1 day of work, the minimum wage is a reference. He may charge you more, but it will be very difficult that you will offer him less, because he will say, come on, the minimum wage is this one. Even in an informal relationship. That's why it's so important to have the minimum wage. Now, how do we formalize workers? That's a completely, I would say, open-ended and difficult to answer question, because informality is very heterogeneous. Informality, you have domestic workers that they also live in the house or things like that. You may have self-employed. You may have workers of not very legal or type of enterprises. You may have per piece type of workers, or workers that they do promotion, that they are not in a fixed place. So will depend very much the strategy on the structure of your labor market. However, there are some things that are quite interesting to implement. Number one, to reduce the chances for enterprises to pay wages in cash, for example. If you say that every worker should be paid through a bank account, for example, yeah, that would be a way of formalize the payment. And if the payment is not done via the bank, the worker, formal or informal, can challenge that payment. That could be a way, you know, because would be easier for the courts to see, well, you go and you show them the pay slip that you receive from the bank, and that would be clear, you know, so there are some strategies, very different, all of them. Yeah, labor inspection is also important, very important, but very difficult. It's costly. It's the efficiency is very low. Labor inspector, they go to where there is visibility of the enterprise. They go where they see a chimney or a factory or a big warehouse, but they don't go to behind the I don't know, a grocery where they are cooking for 200 people in the factory that is 3 blocks away, or things like that, you know. So it's not easy. It depends very much on the. So there are some things that have to be analyzed, but I think that the make mandatory that the payment through the banking sector is important. And the other issue is, well, there is no informal employment if the enterprise doesn't have informal money, cash. That means that they underdeclare sales. Because if you declare all your sales and you don't declare your workers, you are going to pay higher income taxes. So what do enterprises do? They underdeclare sales because they evade taxes. They say, no, pay me cash, I'm going to make a discount. Yeah, they don't want to make the invoice and all these things. When they hold cash, they have to do something with that cash. They cannot put it in the bank because the authorities check now. Banks' accounts are very exposed. You don't go with a large amount of money to your house, especially in some of our countries, because you may get a gun and be robbed, you know. Or so what you do, you get the cash and you tell that worker, I'm going to pay you the minimum wage, but I'm not going to formalize you. I pay you cash. So if you reduce the access to cash by enterprises, you will also reduce informality. This doesn't sound very intuitive for many people. They say, no, it's the cost, the social security. That's not true. They make more money. You know, the tax evasion is much higher than the evasion of the social security. The share of the social security that you are saving if you don't declare a worker is much lower than what you are saving for not declaring sales. Sales tax, value-added tax, and other taxes that could be maybe in some countries. But that's a challenge. To formalize informal sector is a challenge to governments and also to unions, you know, because governments, they suffer that a lot.
Well, yeah, thank you, Daniel, for that. That I think that's a very interesting point to think about, right? The point about the cash, the element of cash in transactions and in employment. So yeah, but the question of the informal economy, informal work, how to transition workers, I guess that deserves another workshop, right? Maybe even another course, another MOOC. Yeah. So we are well over time. So we are going to end the workshop for now. And of course, thank you, Daniel, for all the time, the great inputs, and for also the questions from our participants. Yeah.
Thank you to you. My pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Yeah.
It's a long Benji. It's so late there. Thanks very much, and take care, everyone.